Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, I am so excited to dive in, no pun intended, to dive in, whoa, I almost dropped everything, to Swan Song by Elin Hilderbrand. So I always start these talks with this question of why are we talking about this book? Why would I ask you to read it? Why would I suggest that you read it? And in this case, it seems like it doesn't really even need much of an explanation. We are in the middle of summer. People are looking forward to their beach reads. And Elin Hilderbrand, according to New York Magazine, is in fact the queen of the beach read. She was dubbed that in 2019, which was actually not that long ago. And frankly, I think she was probably the queen of the beach read well before that. But the big deal here is that, in fact, this is her swan song. And back when I ordered it, I did not, in fact, know that. But it's pretty obvious here from the title, Swan Song, that, in fact, she is going to be hanging up her bikini. There were a number of headlines that clued me into this idea, in fact, very quickly, that she was, in fact, retiring. So in Glamour magazine, the sort of headline of the article was Elin Hilderbrand, the queen of the beach read, is closing the book. So there's a lot of puns, as you might imagine, that really got served right up along with these titles. The Wall Street Journal said, the queen of the beach read hangs up her bikini. People magazine actually said Elin Hilderbrand steps into new waters. This was something I read just recently, and what it told us, in fact, is that she is going on to write books with her daughter Shelby. And these are a series of books that are being set in a boarding school that is very much like the one that apparently Shelby attended. And it was a school that specialized in sailing. And there was some sort of crazy party that Elin Hilderbrand has said is very much like a rave. And in fact, that was what inspired her to move on to this new series. So it is not, in fact, that she is never writing again. It is simply that she is not going to write anymore about Nantucket. She said at one point that she was retiring for her fans, and the reason she was doing that is because she never wanted to get to a place where people sort of felt like, that wasn't really quite as good as the last one. And again, I've only read 4, but I am so impressed with how she really brings up lots of good, different material in every one of these. I mean, Nantucket Island, I think it's like 14 miles long or something. It's a tiny little place, and yet she really, with every one, you really feel like you are learning a whole other side. You're really sort of, in some ways it feels like the same community, but there's always a whole fresh look at the thing that is very satisfying. I really liked Summer of 69. If you want to read another one of her books, you can listen to that lecture. It's, you have to scroll way down in the episodes to last summer. But Summer of 69 was fun because, in fact, it was a historical novel. So it was set, which is really actually insulting because, in fact, I was born in 1969. So was Elin Hilderbrand. So the fact that The Summer of 69 is a historical novel, it stung. It stung a little bit when I first realized that, or when I first read that. But it was so fun to go back and read what Nantucket Island looked like in 1969. And, it was right before the Vietnam War. And there's a real sort of pathos in that book that I found really compelling. And I just thought it was very well done. So if you've read Swan Song and you're listening to this and you're hungry for another Elin Hilderbrand, try Summer of 69 and then go back and check out the lecture. So many of you come to the Fox page to look at texts that are potentially a little challenging, books that you feel like maybe you didn't quite get the whole entire thing, books that are classics that you really want to delve more deeply into. That is not necessarily the case with Elin Hilderbrand. In fact, her books, part of the joy of them is that they are pretty easily understood. You really can feel like you're both apprehending and comprehending these novels. But what is so fun for me is to dive into all the ways that Elin Hilderbrand does what she does so incredibly well. So she's writing within a genre, which I think is something that she herself, she resists a little bit. I read a couple of interviews, and one she says that, she hates the words easy or breezy, and certainly hates easy breezy. We're not going to call it anything like that. But she is writing within, some people call it the romance genre, some people call it the beach read. It used to be called chick lit. I think a lot of chick lit now is being rebranded as book club literature. And Elin Hilderbrand's books, I'm not even sure they're like book club so much as they are books that people look forward to reading every summer, mostly women, and really being transported by them. I would definitely put Elin Hilderbrand in the category of atmospheric literature. So we looked at Andre Osserman, who wrote Call Me By Your Name, which is an incredibly atmospheric novel, and it was made into a really beautifully atmospheric movie. Atmospheric novels are simply novels where the atmosphere, the setting, is really, it's almost sort of like another character. It is really essential to the work. And certainly all of Elin Hilderbrand's works are atmospheric in the sense that the setting, which is Nantucket, which is a small little island off the coast of Massachusetts, that atmosphere is incredibly important, and it really is one of the main appeals of her work. But the great thing is that that's only the beginning. Elin Hilderbrand is someone who went to Johns Hopkins. She went to Iowa in their writing program there. She was a fellow and I think did some teaching as well. She is someone who really, really fires on all cylinders. There are so many aspects of these books that are so incredibly satisfying, and that makes, in fact, for a really gratifying deep dive into the work. So I'm really pleased that you're here with me and can't wait to dive in. In terms of Swan Song specifically, when I pre-ordered it back whenever that was, I don't remember, maybe like January, in the dark days of winter, I did not, in fact, realize that it was her actual swan song. She has written 27 of these novels set in Nantucket. I have read 4. I'm really excited, actually, to go back and read some that are set in wintertime. I'm kind of a winter gal, and the idea of what winter looks like on Nantucket Island is very interesting to me. So I've read only 4 of them. There are plenty of people who have read all 27 who pre-order them and look forward to it, all year long, and then sit down in the summer, hopefully on a beach, or even in their own homes, and in order to be transported to the beach. And for those people, I think there are actually some extra rewards because, in fact, there are some repeating characters that we see in Swan Song that have come up before. What we are going to look at today, for those of you who like an agenda, we're going to do a quick biography of Elin Hilderbrand. We're then going to talk about this idea of the atmospheric novel, sort of the ambiance in this novel. And we're going to kind of break down how it is that she does create this incredible ambiance. We're then going to look at character development and narrative stance. Her narrative stance is actually very complicated in some ways. Nothing that, is too taxing, and I don't even think most readers think about it, but it's incredibly deft and actually very effective at character development. We're then going to look at the ways in which many of her novels provide something for everyone. So if you're a younger woman, if you're an older woman, if you're someone who's interested in writing, for example, this is a great book for you. If you're someone who's really interested in socializing, this is also a really great book for you. So we're going to talk about this notion of something for everyone. We're then going to talk about the structure of the novel, which is also complex. Then we're going to talk about just a few quibbles that I have, and then we will talk about the ending. There will be no spoilers today. It's great because I can talk about the ending of this book without spoiling anything. And obviously it's very important, to not ruin this for you if you have not, in fact, finished it, or if you are listening to this before you dive in. No pun intended. That is an excellent segue into our biography, our very brief biography of Elin Hilderbrand. She was born in July of 1969. She's, a month older than I am. I was born in August of 1969. And she would summer on Cape Cod. And those summers were these idyllic times for her and for her family until she was 16 years old. And her father, this is all, by the way, coming straight from Wikipedia. This is not some sort of secret knowledge. So her father, in fact, when she was 16 years old, died in an airplane crash, which is horrific. And after that, she had to work during the summer. And she sort of vowed when she was working these difficult jobs that, in fact, she would try to always have a summer. She went to Johns Hopkins and also, as I mentioned, went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop. That biography alone, just those writing credentials, is enough to really alert you to the fact that she is really a very, very strong writer. In 1993, she moved to Nantucket. She would have been 23, 24 years old. In 1995, she married a guy named Chip Cunningham. They have 3 kids together. The year 2000 is when she published her first novel. I read something interesting that the very first thing she published was in 17 magazine. I don't actually know what it was. I think it was a short story back when those glossy magazines would publish fiction. And she made something like $800, and it felt easy and was very satisfying. And then things slowed down. Her very first novel apparently sold 2,500 copies, which that was the first print run. That is not a lot. I wrote a book that sold 7,000 copies, and honestly, I thought 7,000 was like zero. Like, I just couldn't believe. Also, my advance was $10,000. So, these numbers, when you're actually, and in fact, we were, Elin and I had the same publisher. We were both at St. Martin's. So these numbers are very small. They're, before you get into the writing world, you think you're going to, sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and then you're very pleased to sell out your print run of 7. But so Elin sold, 2,500 of her first book, and it took her a while to make it to be the number 1 New York Times bestseller. She drafts her novels longhand by the ocean when she is able to, which is really crazy to me. In 2014, she had a mastectomy and is now cancer-free. And in one of the novels, I think, has to do with her diagnosis. And, it's not a nonfiction, it's a novel, but it is, it really builds upon the idea of her experience with cancer. In 2015, she divorced from her husband. And again, as I mentioned before, has written 27 novels, one every summer. This is such a feat to me. I mean, these are, there is a kind of a sameness to them, but frankly, that's very welcome. It's very, sort of reassuring. It's in fact very much like, coming back to the place that feels, familiar to you, if you are lucky enough, in fact, to have a place where you have gone, several summers in a row. It's this idea of sort of coming back again to a place that's just absolutely delightful and is also deeply familiar in ways that is very satisfying. One of her novels has been adapted for television. It's The Perfect Couple with Nicole Kidman and Liev Schreiber. I never know how to say his name. I think it's Liev Schreiber. And I think like Dakota Fanning is in it. And production began, or like the shooting of that began in 2023. There is not a release date. But also Ellen Pompeo of, Grey's Anatomy fame also I think is working on a trilogy that I have not read. I have not read The Perfect Couple or this trilogy that Ellen Pompeo is interested in developing. So these are very cinematic books. I mean, it's actually surprising to me that they have not been adapted yet. And I'm very excited about the Nicole Kidman one. I'm hoping it has kind of like Big Little Lies vibe. We are now going to dive into the book itself. So I'm actually standing here in front of these things that I found. They're doors from like an 18th century sailing ship. And for those of you on the YouTube, you can see I love them partially because the paintings are so goofy. They're like really beautiful in some ways, but also very goofy. There's a guy playing some sort of flute to a woman, and it just looks so awkward and so funny, and her dog looks so awkward and so funny. I'm not a huge antiquer, but I really do love this kind of thing. And I really love the idea of this feeling very much like New England and feeling a little bit like Nantucket. So in contrast to the very old doors in front of me, we have this brand new, very bright Elin Hilderbrand Swan song. So it is absolutely no surprise that Elin Hilderbrand, the big sort of name at the top, the big bright white name, is Elin Hilderbrand and not the title. When you are someone who is as prolific and as well known and as popular as she is, the marketing people are definitely going to have your name first and foremost. It's like Tom Clancy or John Grisham or any one of these people. Those were such old and such male names. I should let me try that again. It's like Colleen Hoover or, oh my gosh, the Irish writer, the name Sally Rooney. Wow, that just went right out of my head. Although it didn't come back. That came right back in. So we have the name, is really what is selling this book. And I really like Swan Song as a title. So I also like the fact that this is a woman who's diving in. There is a sameness, again, to the cover of these novels. There's generally, sort of a beautiful woman doing some sort of beachy thing or a couple on the beach or whatever it is. Again, I'm excited to read one of the winter wartime ones, I can't picture any of them in my mind, so it will be interesting to look at that. But I like the idea swan song for all the sort of different resonances. And we are, in fact, going to look at a couple of very quick examples of swan song, the way that it is actually, sort of quoted, and the ways that it pops up in the book itself. We open the book and we have this long, long list of all of these things. It was very satisfying. I went through and circled the ones that I had read. So it seems nice to me to build a whole Elin Hilderbrand, library. And for some reason, I'm really interested in having just the hardcover copies, as if they're prized possessions. I mean, they are kind of prized possessions in some ways, but I'm a little fussy, it turns out, about my Elin Hilderbrand editions. Swan Song is, right here in the front, and we have actually a very beautiful sort of sailing vessel here that looks quite a bit like the one that is in my old panel from my old ship behind me. We have her name again, and then we have this dedication. I will end where I began. This book is for Chip Cunningham with friendship and profound gratitude. So Chip Cunningham is the father of her children, the man that she was married to. She had a really nice description in something that I read about the two of them being in Iowa, and that he, it's maybe in the acknowledgments, probably, he was working in an Oral-B factory, and a toothbrush factory, and he had to look for something called wild nylon or something along those lines. So you got the sense that, in fact, Chip Cunningham really very much, allowed for her career in some ways to be what it is. I'm not totally sure of that, but in the acknowledgments, she gives this sense that, he was very supportive when she was trying to educate herself and really learn all of the skills of her trade, which in fact she did. I mean, she's just very, very good at creating an entire world and doing it in ways that are very clever. And a lot of it feels quite a bit like an MFA kind of feel, but in many ways that's also excellent. I mean, the critique leveled at these MFA programs is that everybody comes out, sort of sounding the same. And I do, first of all, don't agree with that. I don't think it's true, but I do think it can save people from some real, problems. And I also think that it can really develop some very satisfying patterns in writers that end up feeling very gratifying for the reader. I'm a real sucker for those times when the title of a book pops up in the text, and that happens, in fact, on page 105, and it is very satisfying. We begin the book with this chief, the chief of police, Ed Capanash. I don't know if you say Capanash or Cape Nash, but I say Capanash in my mind. And it becomes clear that he is going to have to help out in this one last case about a house burning down and somebody being missing. And in fact, it becomes such a kind of difficult and convoluted case that they are, some of the main players are saying it seems like Ed has sort of drummed this up as a swan song. So this is the woman who is about to take his place. Her name is Zara. She's going to be the new, police chief of Nantucket. She sighs, then blurts out, "It's like he wants some kind of swan song." And then down at the bottom, one of the officers, Dixon, says, "You're right about one thing. This is a hell of a swan song." So I like this. I mean, obviously the resonance here is with the fact that this swan song is also the last thing that Elin Hilderbrand is going to write about Nantucket. So a swan song, very famously, swans are supposed to be mute, which I think is not totally true. I think they can, I don't know, they make some sort of noises. But the sort of, the sort of mythology around it is that, in fact, they are mute. And then right before they die, they make, some sort of wailing noise or honking or something. They also, there's another myth that they mate for life. That actually might be true. I did not look at, an in-depth analysis of swans and their mating patterns, but we do think of them as very romantic, which, Elin Hilderbrand, as far as I know, is single, and she is not, in fact, really leaning into the idea of marriage and monogamy and mating for life. But in fact, there is a lot of romance in this book, on a bunch of different levels and through a bunch of different storylines. So the idea of, these romantic swans as being sort of central in terms of the reader's imagination is really excellent. And I like the idea then of how we kind of, we're not conflating Elin Hilderbrand and the chief of police. It's not like you're sort of feeling like they have a lot of the same energy, but it is nice to think that, he's gotten to an age where he's ready to retire and, she's not going to retire, but she's ready to move on to something else. In fact, Police Chief Ed is the perfect way for us to dive into the book itself. The novel begins with a prologue, and it also begins with a date. So Elin Hilderbrand is very good with the chapter titles. It's so funny. That is one thing that I tend to be sloppy about. There's an old saw here at the Fox page that if you want to read better and become a more, sort of satisfied reader, all you have to do is pay attention. One thing I tend not to pay attention to are chapter titles. And she's so good at it that I really make a concerted effort. In this case, it's just prologue. That's not particularly telling. But we begin also with a date. Thursday, August 22nd, 6 p.m. So this is, in fact, at the end of the summer. It's really beautiful the way that the summer contains a lot of these stories that Elin Hilderbrand is telling. So it's nice to think that we have this span of time and that things are going to be condensed and a decent amount of sort of temporal pressure is put on the events because, in fact, we are expecting things to be sort of wound up by the end of the season. So in this case, the prologue is at the end of the summer, and we know very quickly that we are going to go back to the beginning. But here is what we have in the very beginning. And, again, every time we're going to discuss anything about the novel, it's a chance to sort of dig into how good her prose is. She's really such a strong writer. Rumors about Nantucket Police Chief Ed Capanash's retirement have been swirling around for the past 2 years. Though when asked directly, the chief said, "I'm far too busy to contemplate retirement." However, 3 days after the big scare in February, Ed told his wife, Andrea, from his hospital bed at Mass General, "That's it. I'm finished. I'll just stay on through the summer while we find someone to replace me." So the big scare, in fact, turns out to be a heart attack. But I like this idea of that these retirement rumors have been swirling. It's significant that the very first word of this novel is rumors. And rumors are something that we see in every single one of all of the ones that I have read. A lot of Elin Hilderbrand's works have to do with rumors. And in fact, there's something called the Cobblestone Telegraph, which we're about to get to, that really, sort of plays into this idea, and it is repeated throughout all of the different novels. And it really plays to this idea of this kind of rumor mill. So we have this idea of rumors as being very important and being very central, the very first word of the novel. So we have this big scare that happens, and we are introduced right away at the beginning to Ed Capanash and Andrea, his wife. And then we skip down a little bit. Ed had been giving a safety talk in the gymnasium of Nantucket Elementary when his left arm started to tingle. He felt short of breath, his vision splotched, and the next thing he knew, he was being loaded onto a medevac chopper and flown to MGH for emergency bypass surgery. "You had the kind of heart attack we call the widowmaker," Dr. Very Important said, "a full blockage of your LAD artery. You were lucky the paramedics were right there, otherwise this could have ended differently." And then we have, as Dr. Bigshot gave Ed a lecture about exercise, diet, and above all, stress, Ed gauged Andrea's reaction to the term widowmaker. Not good. So a couple of things I want to point out here. One is that Elin Hilderbrand really loads up her prose with names. And there are times when I'm like, wait, do we need to know here, like the fire chief, she has here, yes, the fire chief, M-, Stu Vick, M-, and EMTs from the department, blah, blah, blah. And part of me is like, am I expected to remember the name Stu Vick? Like, this doesn't seem like it's going to be a major player throughout the rest of the book. Or you sort of suspect maybe he is. Turns out he is not, in fact, a major player. But so part of me is like, this seems like a lot of detail for me to have to carry. One of the things that I learned in my MFA program is you want to think of details as being sort of like rocks, and that your reader is having this backpack on and they are putting all of these detail rock things into their backpack, and that they will get overloaded with details unless those details are really meaningful. So sometimes when I have all of these names with Elin Hilderbrand, I'm a little bit like, gosh, do we need to know all of these? But in fact, I think what she does in lots of cases is these names are very telling. They're very sort of evocative. Stu Vick as an EMT, there's something about that name that tells us everything we need to know about him. We also have this sort of cute thing that she is doing where he refers, Ed Capanash, refers to Dr. Very Important, and then he refers to him as Dr. Big Shot. And then a little further down, he says, Dr. Master of the Universe. So we have the sense of Ed, of hearing Ed's voice. And this is very important. I mean, if you're a reader who is kind of allergic to cuteness, you might be like, okay, this seems a little bit too cute. But in fact, this is something that is allowing us to get to know Ed. So we are going to talk in a little bit about the narrative stance, but we have here what these are words that Ed would be thinking. So even though it's a third person narrator, we are in fact very close to Ed because we are hearing not only his thoughts, but his attitude about the doctor in a very efficient way. You know, he's not threatened. I don't know, maybe he's annoyed by sort of, the stature of this doctor who is in fact using words like widowmaker that are scaring his wife. So you have this sense of very efficiently and very deftly, a good sense of what Ed Capenash is all about and what this chief of police thinks about his fancy cardiologist. So that was the beginning of the prologue. That was the opening of the novel. And then we have the first chapter. And the prologue doesn't feel like a separate thing. It definitely feels like you are beginning the novel. And in fact, when we have the first chapter, it doesn't start on a new page. There's just a space break. And then we have a number 1. And then it says the Cobblestone Telegraph 1. So it's a Roman numeral there. So I like this so much, partially because this is a familiar thing. We've heard from the Cobblestone Telegraph in other, in other novels. And the Roman numeral 1 at the end of Cobblestone Telegraph 1 is also signaling to us that this is a pattern, that we're going to see the Cobblestone Telegraph again and again. So here's what the Cobblestone Telegraph sounds like. Most towns have a rumor mill. We here on Nantucket have what's known as the Cobblestone Telegraph, and Blonde Sharon has long been the switchboard operator. Everything goes through her. So this is doing such important work. First of all, this idea of the rumor mill, this is a very, there's quite a bit of cliche in this book, but I think she uses it very well. Cliche can get to be really tiresome if it is used in ways that feel totally gratuitous. In Elin Hilderbrand's hands, it mostly feels efficient. I mean, if she were going to try to not come up with rumor mill and try to come up with some sort of synonym, it might end up feeling kind of belabored. But it's in fact a good use of cliche there. So we have this rumor mill, but then the idea of the Cobblestone Telegraph it's such a great description because it is really telling us a lot about the town of Nantucket. The main street is still cobblestones, which gives you a sense of sort of going back in time and all of the historical resonance of that space. So does the telegraph. So obviously this is not like a, computer. What we are talking about here is a very old means of communication. And the idea of a switchboard operator, I'm not sure that you have switchboard operators for telegraphs. I feel like that's more of like an old telephone kind of thing. But you have this idea here of switchboard operators and telegraphs, which really give you a sense of the history in which Nantucket is steeped. But more importantly, in some ways, is the fact that right from the beginning in every section of the Cobblestone Telegraph, we have the first person plural. So the first person plural is easy to understand. It's just we. We did this, we did that. I is the first person singular, and we is the first person plural. So usually when you have an omniscient narrator, it will say, Ed Capenash had a heart attack, in Nantucket at the elementary school. So it will tell things in the third person. He did this, he did that. His wife, Andrea, was not psyched. But so you have this idea of things being told in the third person. And in this case, the we is very important because it's giving us a sense of the community on Nantucket as being, first of all, very cohesive and being very sort of homogenous, which is both good and bad, obviously. But the other thing that it does is it gives us a sense of kind of the claustrophobic nature of this town and the idea of rumors as having a lot of weight, in fact, because this is such an insular place where everybody is, sort of in everybody else's business. But I think the most interesting thing that this we, the first person plural, does for the reader is the reader is included. So when our narrator here is saying we do this and we do that, there's a psychological thing where you are part of the we. I mean, the reader ends up being sort of part of this we. Obviously you're not like part of this, but there is something psychological that happens when we read this, that allows the reader to sort of feel like they are included. So this return to the second person plural, and it keeps coming up throughout the book, it is very powerful. That is a good segue actually into this idea of narrative stance. So on page 3, which is the first page of the novel, we have Ed Capanash being told from the third person narrator, rumors about Nantucket Police Chief Ed Capanash's retirement have been swirling around for the past 2 years. So this is an objective third-person narrator that's giving us, a long-term history. It's kind of this all-knowing narrator who is really able to sort of pull the lens way back and say, rumors. So this is someone who is seeing everything that's happening in the community. It's someone who's been there for a long time. I mean, it's not even a someone. It's not an entity like that. It's kind of this all-knowing force. And that what's so beautiful, though, is that force enters into Ed Capanash. We have things like this. Ed sighed. He'd married a tattletale. But also, Ed felt guilty. Had he played fast and loose with his health? Yes. Could he just give 2 weeks' notice and leave the public safety of the island up for grabs? He could not. So this idea of, Ed sighed, he'd married a tattletale. You get the sense of tattletale as, again, being his word. That is something he would say. And then we have these questions that he is asking himself, but also Ed felt guilty. That's, it's very clear what he is feeling, but you do have this sense of being inside him. Had he played fast and loose with his health? Yes. So these are words that he would use. It's still a third person narrator. He's still saying, was Ed guilty? Yes. That kind of thing. It's not, I felt guilty. It's not like all of a sudden we are inside Ed's, mind, but we are in fact in his mind, but in a way that allows the omniscient narrator to maintain control and to feel like this is a narrator who can move in and out of people's minds in a way that is very orderly and isn't too jarring. So then if we look at page 6, it's really nice because now we have a shift to Andrea. We know who Andrea is. She's, Chief Ed's wife, and we have this. Andrea notices the fried shrimp and squid, the helpings of pasta and the rare steak, but she zips her lip. So I love this because zips her lip is, that's a phrase that Ed and Andrea would use. It sounds like one that Andrea would. I love that idea too. I mean, zips her lip is there's something kind of sassy about that really appeals to me. I also just like the sound of it. So you have this sense here of Andrea as being concerned about her husband's health, but it's really great because we are in her brain. Andrea notices the fried shrimp and squid. We're seeing the table the way that she is seeing it, and we're seeing her urge to say something to her husband, like, don't you think you should not be eating all this fried food? But she decides to zip her lip. So on page 3, we are inside Ed's mind and using his, language. And then by page 6, we are inside Andrea's, which is, again, very satisfying. And then, of course, on page 10, when we get to the Cobblestone Telegraph, we have this. We here on Nantucket have what's known as the Cobblestone Telegraph. So this idea of we then is another shift. So we have these really beautiful ways that this narrator is very nimble. It's really well done. Again, I think most readers are probably not even thinking about this, but it is something that Elin Hilderbrand does very well. On page 13, this is still very early in the novel, but we have here kind of another way that this nimble narrator is moving into the different minds of these different characters. So on page 13, there's a space break, and then we have Sharon. Blonde Sharon being the switchboard operator of the telegraph. Sharon plops herself down on a bench at the Steamship Authority ferry terminal. And then a little bit further down, oh my gosh, if you're on YouTube, I keep doing this thing where if I make a peace sign or if I do a thumbs up, all these balloons and different things start popping up. I didn't even know that would happen. iMovie is really enjoying itself. Okay, so we have Sharon plopping herself down, and then the beginning of the next paragraph, there's an italicized thing that says, why, Romeo wonders, does blonde Sharon have a notebook and pen at the ready? He can't think of a single reason, but Romeo loves a mystery, especially one that involves a beautiful woman. I mean, that's a little bit objectifying. It's also so on the nose that his name is Romeo, but I actually really like that too. A lot of times, and we're going to get to this later, Elin Hilderbrand does stuff that should feel contrived, but because it is either so on the nose or because she in fact names it as being a little bit convenient, or sort of explains it in some way, it doesn't end up feeling contrived. It just ends up feeling satisfying. So it's very fitting, in fact, that Romeo is this love interest for Sharon. But what's really impressive to me on a literary level is that here on page 13, we are in Sharon's mind, and then not one paragraph later, we're in Romeo's mind, and she does it by having this italicized thought that he has. So the reader is, it's very clear to the reader that we are moving from Sharon to Romeo's mind. It's really very telling, and it's a really beautiful way to give us all the different perspectives and to understand in real time what kind of tension is building. In this case, it's some sexual tension. Then we have on page 130, this is the last example. So I liked this only because it seemed so bold. So this is chapter 14. The title is Party Animal, which, that's a cliche. That was one that I didn't really love quite as much. But, it does its job. And it begins like this. We show up wearing flamingo, blush, salmon, magenta, fuchsia, and rose gold. We wear pearl, blanched almond, alabaster, polar ice cap, and cloud. Fast Eddie is in a pink and white seersucker suit. The dentist Andy McMahon wears neon pink top hat, and his wife Rachel is in swan feathers. So this idea of we is so bold here. We show up in, and then there's this long list of the colors. It's the pink and white party. So you have, all these various shades of pink and then these various shades of white. And then we get into the specifics of Eddie and apparently the dentist, Andy McMahon. Again, here we have first name, last name. And it is sort of telling. I'm not totally sure that we need the names of all of these people, but this is an interesting, sort of thought experiment here. If we just said, if she told us the dentist was there with a pink top hat, it might not feel quite as fleshed out as the dentist, Andy McMahon, was there with his wife. And in fact, the dentist's name comes up a few times. So you do have a sense, I think, of the names as functioning pretty well, even if sometimes it feels like there may be a couple too many to try to juggle and to try to remember. But the important thing here is this idea of the we as this first person plural that comes up again and again, not just in the Cobblestone Telegraph chapters, but throughout the novel. And when it does come up, this is this kind of, you get the sense of the whole crowd, but again, the reader is kind of on the inside. And again, it's being explained as this kind of monolithic unit, for better or for worse. It's always important when we have talked about a concept like this narrative stance to ask, so what? So yes, we have this nimble narrator that very efficiently is allowing you to know these people in a way that I think is very satisfying. It's just, I think this narrative stance that she is in control of in every one of her novels is just very impressive. And it's harder to do than it looks. She's shifting a lot of registers. She's using a lot of different verbiage. Romeo is speaking about things differently than Lamont, who is speaking about them differently than Casey or Coco. So it's really giving us a broad view of the community just by dint of the narrator. It's really well done. Now that we've finished with this narrative stance, we're going to move on to talk about the novel as atmospheric. So this simply means, this ambiance that she is creating. And I really think it's one of the best things that she does. She does it so well with this three-pronged approach that I'm going to outline. But I think it's one of the things that's most satisfying. You really are transported into this other environment because she creates this atmosphere so effectively. So one way that she does it, it's very sort of basic, is this idea of names. And I'm not talking here about names of characters. I'm talking about names of things on the island. She's using a lot of names and a lot of kind of lists of names. And there's part of me that's like, why is this so effective? And it is because she is selecting, in fact, names that are very evocative. So if we look at page 106, this is when Coco and Casey are together. The night before, as they ate fish tacos at the oyster catcher, their feet in the sand, Casey made a list of Nantucket summer things they still had to do. There were at least a dozen beaches to lounge on, afternoons at Cisco Brewers with live music and food trucks, rainy days at either the Whaling Museum or the Dreamland Theater, oysters at Crew, a sunset cruise on the Endeavor, singing around the piano at the club car, and dancing at the chicken box, followed by a late-night Stubbies run. So there are so many things that are evocative here. First of all, we have these oysters and the fish tacos. So you have this sense of seafood here. And there is the presence of the beach. We have the idea of their feet in the sand and all of these beaches that they are going to lounge on. But then we have these proper nouns, these specific things that even if you've never been to these places, the oyster catcher, I don't know what that is, but you can imagine. And then we have Cisco Brewers, and it has live music and food trucks. There's a vibe there. It's some sort of artisan brewery with with these live music and the food trucks. And then the Whaling Museum and Dreamland Theater. I mean, the Whaling Museum, the history of whaling on the island of Nantucket with Moby Dick, I mean, it's a very storied kind of whaling idea. And so the Whaling Museum is this really nice evocation of the history of the island. And then Dreamland Theater, you get this kind of idea of like dreaminess, like the whole island is kind of dreamy. And the idea of, spending a rainy summer afternoon in a movie theater is just delicious. And then the idea of singing around the piano at the club car. Club car gives like kind of an old money, but also kind of like train situation. And then dancing at the chicken box sounds like some sort of dive. I don't know exactly what the chicken box is all about. And then the late night Stubbies run, I don't know what that is either. But Stubbies is the kind of name that again is very evocative of a certain experience. You have a sense of really, I mean, without knowing what any of those places are really all about, you can sort of imagine, your imagination is in fact doing a lot of work. She does the same thing later when she is talking about Martha's Vineyard. She says this: Casey is dying to stay at the Charlotte Inn. Back when Casey and Isla used to talk about coming to Nantucket on vacation, Casey imagined a weekend trip to the Vineyard. Staying at the Charlotte Inn, hanging out at clothing-optional Lucy Vincent Beach, drinks at Nancy's, dinner at the Red Cat, dancing at the Ritz, breakfast at Morning Glory Farm. So the idea that she calls it the Vineyard instead of Martha's Vineyard, you have this sense of her as being, very much a local and certainly someone who is from Massachusetts, or not necessarily, but someone who knows Martha's Vineyard well. And then this idea of clothing-optional Lucy Vincent Beach. So Martha's Vineyard is known for being more liberal. And so the idea of Lucy Vincent, naming I don't know who that is, but naming a beach after a woman is, you imagine she's maybe like a suffragette or something, and this is kind of some feminist thing. I don't know if that's true, but this is where my imagination went. And certainly the idea of this being clothing optional, I mean, it really does evoke a thing that is, it's very impressive, all of the sort of shorthand and the way that these things are evoking so much. I do know, too, that on Nantucket Island, there was some sort of ordinance that says that all of the beaches can be topless. So, you got to hand it. I think Nantucket, is definitely known for being more sort of conservative. And, so you got to hand it to them for not being so stuffy that they are going to make everybody wear bathing suit tops. So the next way that we're going to talk about is the idea of these details that she's choosing. So these are details that are slightly different than the place names we just were talking about, or even the names of people. We're going to just look at one example on page 131. On Nantucket, the prevailing aesthetic for everything, even parties, is understatement. The old society matrons pretend to go to no effort when they entertain, and some of them aren't even pretending. One infamous hostess sends out invitations on index cards that read simply, "Drinks, 6 p.m." We are elated to find that the Richardsons' party gives maximum effort. The entrance is a soaring arch of Juliet roses. Members of the Nantucket Garden Club inform us that Juliets are among the most expensive flowers in the world. On the far side of the arch, servers hold trays of drinks, flutes of Laurent Perrier rosé champagne, a cocktail called the Pink Lady, made with 888 vodka, of course, and pink lemonade for the teetotalers. So these are all details. We're going to talk about description next, and this kind of is description, but this is a very specific kind of description where we are just kind of listing details that are very telling. So when she's talking about this specific kind of rose, having an arch of, real roses is already opulent enough. But then we have this excellent reference. It is in parentheses about the Nantucket Garden Club, the fact that Nantucket has a garden club, and they are, invited to this party, and they're talking about these expensive roses, tells you a lot about the island. So this is not a description of the Nantucket Garden Club and what they're up to, so much as it's sort of a detail that she is selecting, that Hilderbrand is selecting, that is so telling. So, the brand of the champagne, the cocktail, the idea of also thinking about the guests who don't drink. So all of these different things are adding, they're all, discrete details, discrete in the sense of like separate details, not discrete. I do not think that anybody on this island has a lot of discretion in this book. But then we have this really excellent use of detail throughout the entire novel. A little further down, we have this paragraph. We saunter onto the front lawn where a pink and white striped tent shades a full bar, a huge grazing board, and the guitar player Sean Lee, who at the moment is playing Pretty in Pink by the Psychedelic Furs. So Sean Lee, again, here we have a name that's kind of dropped in. As I'm saying all of this, it kind of makes me wonder if she's referring, maybe... So when I wrote the book that I wrote, it was nonfiction, and we had to go to great lengths to change the names of people. And one of the things the lawyer said, which was so interesting, I, of course, had named everybody using the same initials. And she's like, okay, nonfiction 101, you cannot have the same initials. So we really had to come up with entirely different names. They couldn't even remotely sound alike. But in this case, because it is fiction, Elin can do whatever she wants to do. So maybe Sean Lee is code. I mean, maybe this is a real guitar player. But so this idea maybe of these very specific names, first and last names being included so often, maybe some of this is little tributes to different people that Elin Hilderbrand in fact knows. But even if that is not the case, Sean Lee, I mean, that's evocative of Sean, Lennon, or even just this idea, Sean Lee, it just sounds kind of like a surfer person, someone who would be playing something by the Psychedelic Furs, etc. So the use of music throughout the book is something, it's a quibble that I'm going to just go ahead and launch right now instead of saving it for later, which is I have never been a fan of people using music by title, by song and title in work. I know I can sing this song for you. I am not going to. And it's a song I know incredibly well, and I understand the vibe that she's trying to get across, and I don't know why it is not effective for me. I know for a lot of people it's great, and they love it when a lot of music is mentioned. I'm not exactly sure why. It doesn't work very well for me. It's a kind of shorthand, even when I do know the song, that is not particularly effective. If anything, it's kind of frustrating. I'm like, I'm not hearing the song, so it's not particularly effective. And a lot of times, if I don't know the song, I'm like, okay, this is really honestly doing nothing for me. And in fact, it's taking me out of the flow of the narrative, which is, kind of the kiss of death. Okay, so, but overall, aside from my own, sense that the music doesn't work super well, the choice of details is excellent. So we have the proper names that are, there are lots and lots of them throughout, and they're very evocative, even if you have no idea what these places even are. And then we have the choice of details, which is excellent. And then the last thing we're going to look at is her description. So her descriptions of things that are happening on the island, whether it's the people themselves or whether it is Nantucket itself, the descriptions are excellent. So we're going to go back to page 17. So this is a description of Bull Richardson, who is one of the main players throughout the novel, and this is when Coco first meets him. And this description is so strong. "I have a question for you," the gentleman says in a broad Australian accent. The guy is overdressed for the banana deck. He's in a linen blazer the color of wheat bread and a crisp white shirt. His wife has long chestnut brown hair styled in sumptuous barrel curls. Her silk bias-cut dress is giving Academy Award presenter vibes. So I like the description of her a tiny bit less. Those barrel curls, the use of sumptuous there, I really do like. Barrel curls, I think what we're trying to get at here is that she's a little bit, predictable in some ways, and they are, in fact, overdressed. So, and it's a very telling description of this woman who is Leslie. But Bull Richardson, this idea of a linen blazer the color of wheat bread and a crisp white shirt, I just thought that was so excellent. I mean, you can absolutely see the linen blazer the color of wheat bread. It's just, it's not too far afield that you're like, wait, why are you, drawing those two things together? And it's just so evocative in some ways of exactly what I want to see and what I want to be able to picture. On page 11, this I loved. So sometimes there's a lot of humor throughout the book. And I do think that Elin Hilderbrand sometimes, she has these, again, descriptions that are so spot on and they are so telling and so evocative. So Sharon, blonde Sharon, who is the telegraph operator, the switchboard operator, she, and the sort of queen of the rumor mill, she has recently been ditched by her husband. He's now dating, of course, the his physical therapy instructor or whatever practitioner. So Heather, who is Sharon's sister, says this, or the narrator says this about Heather. Heather is also the voice of reason. When Sharon admits that what bothers her most about Walker leaving her is being a cliche, Heather says, just promise not to wear statement necklaces and fake eyelashes and take cruises in the Mediterranean looking for a rich replacement husband. Sharon blinks. That had been her plan exactly. So I think this is very funny, but this like spot on description of this kind of woman who has recently been left and is now wearing her statement necklaces and her fake eyelashes. It's such a great sort of shorthand because it is so. It's such a good evocation of a time and of a type of person, and the way that it is folded in here to this kind of humorous thing between these two sisters is just excellent. So again, though, we have this really very strong description. The last one we're going to look at is on page 83. This is when Casey, who is the local, is seeing Lamont for the first time in a long time, and Lamont is a person who she went to a couple of proms with. Lamont jumps out of the truck. He has, wow, definitely changed. Matured, grown up, gotten smoke show hot. He's completely ripped. His white polo strains over his broad chest and biceps, and his jeans fit perfectly. Ha! Casey can't believe Lamont Oakley is now giving leading man when all through high school he was a math nerd. He was also the best sailor the island had ever seen, though ironically, hardly anyone at Nantucket High School cared about sailing. They'd all taken free lessons in second grade, but for the most part, it was viewed as a pastime for summer people. So there is so much here that is really, really working well. First of all, we have these words like smoke show hot and what's the other thing? Oh, that he is giving leading man. So these are syntax things and these are, words that in fact someone who is Casey's age, she's, in her mid-20s, that she would be saying these kinds of things. It's very different than, zip your lip or whatever it was in the beginning that Andrea was saying. So you have this idea of a completely different register, and Casey is the one here who is seeing Lamont. So it's perfect that we are having this description of Lamont that really speaks so clearly to what Casey would be seeing and how she would be describing it. It's so good. But then we also have this description of him as this excellent sailor, and we learn this very cool thing, which is apparently everyone who is, going to second grade public school in Nantucket has sailing lessons, and it is, in fact, ironic that on an island, a tiny island in the Atlantic, that in fact sailing is not a big deal in high school. So you're learning all of this stuff that's very interesting, and you feel like you're gaining a bunch of information about the island of Nantucket, but in a way that is so organic and is so well done. Now that we have kind of, looked at all of the different ways that she has created this atmospheric novel, it's important, again, to ask, so what? So she has used, these place names and then also this very deft selection of details and finally these kind of more robust descriptions. All of that is so important because she is, in fact, transporting us to this place. So when people are reading in the summertime, there's lots of travel happening. And if you are not traveling and you wish you were traveling, you can do some armchair traveling by, in fact, reading novels that really do transport you places. And I would say, again, that one of the things that's so compelling about these novels in particular by Elin Hilderbrand is there is kind of a familiarity and a consistency, but you do always feel like you're learning something new. Like in this case, about the sailing stuff on the island. As far as I know, that is not something that has been a major thread throughout her other works. So now that we have discussed the different ways that she is creating the atmosphere, we're going to move on to this idea that these books have something for everyone. So Casey Capanash is one of the main characters in the novel, and we have this excellent interlude where she is working in the NICU in San Francisco. You get a little sense of, what San Francisco is all about, and there's this very moving thing about what life is like as a NICU nurse. I found that so excellent, and this is, you get the sense with all of these different aspects of the Elin Hilderbrand novels that a lot of research has been done, that she really knows what she's talking about, and that everything feels very authentic, but it also feels organic. I mean, you feel maybe a little bit like, oh, okay, here we have someone who did a bunch of research on what it is to be a NICU nurse, but it really pays off because we have this kind of, this idea of her as coming from outside the island and having been gone for a while, But because we have this vision of her in the NICU, it really brings a lot about her personality to the island. So we have this very kind of fleshed out sense of her as a person. She's also gay, and so we have this whole drama where she is having an affair with a woman. Well, it's not really an affair, but she is in love with a woman who is about to be married to a man. It's really well done because it doesn't feel gratuitous. It's not like, okay, here's our token lesbian, because in fact, there is another lesbian couple, another gay couple, Blythe and Linda, who come, I think from the mainland. They like motor out, or maybe they come from Martha's Vineyard or something. So you have it doesn't feel particularly like tokenism, and there's a nice kind of romance that is happening. Both, there's a lot of tension about whether or not Casey is going to stay with her love interest, or whether this other love interest is in fact going to be more satisfying to her. So we have this idea of Casey Capanash as being a young woman in her 20s who would really provide a lot if you were someone who, is a younger woman. I am 54, but the Casey Capanash thing, it's also a little nostalgic. Like, I'm sort of like, oh, boy, that's what it would have felt like if I were a NICU nurse, or, oh, gosh, that was like a total experience I never had, or, a sense of like, oh, gosh, right, that's what it feels like to be, angsting about love in your 20s. So even if you are not, in fact, someone who identifies exactly with Casey, there is a lot to be had in terms of this idea of something for everyone. So I definitely identify more with someone like Sharon. I don't identify with Sharon in terms of the rumor mill, but certainly this idea of someone in their 50s who is wanting to sort of remake herself. So her children are getting older, she's wondering what she's going to do, and in fact decides that she wants to become a writer. So I imagine that there are a lot of, readers of Elin Hilderbrand who are in, their 30s to 60s. So someone like Sharon, who is reinventing herself, would be a really compelling character to feel like you have a sense of someone who you can really identify with. But we also have Coco. So Coco is the young woman who was working in the Virgin Islands and then comes up to the Northeast. You have this real sense of her as being kind of a foil to Casey. She grew up, I think, in Arkansas. She is someone who doesn't understand the ways of Nantucket. And so Casey and Coco are real foils. So if you're someone who maybe feels like you're on the outside, and you're someone who is, somebody who maybe came from a difficult home situation, then you in fact might feel more aligned, in fact, with Coco. You'll note that most of these people are women. I mean, I think maybe you could identify with the retiring police chief, or maybe you could identify with Lamont. I actually identified a little more with Lamont's mom, who is an older woman who seems very sweet and is very, ready to welcome Coco at different points in the novel. But so we're getting these images of men, but I think everybody is fairly clear that the vast majority of the readership of Elin Hilderbrand are women. So in fact, we are understanding the women in a way that we probably don't fully comprehend the men. There were a couple of times where it felt like a little too much. It felt like we were kind of trying to either like get into a new vein of something that felt like it was a different thing in this novel. What I'm thinking of here is that Sharon has a son who has type 1 diabetes. I have a son who has type 1 diabetes. And it's funny because, I have that same app, on my phone, and not anymore because he is now 27 years old. But like, I really know what that would be like. But I was a little critical because a bunch of the details just didn't quite wash with me. And I think that's the risk of trying to offer something for everyone. Part of it is like, if it's your 27th book, you need to kind of bust into some new terrain, and you need to have more people feel like they can identify with your characters. But you certainly do run the risk of details that, in fact, don't really align with the experience of a reader, despite the fact that you're trying, in fact, to allow them to identify with your character. I mentioned that we were going to talk about structure, and I'm just going to touch on it very briefly. Hilderbrand does this cool thing. She did it in another novel that I read as well, where she plays a little bit with time. So the structure of the novel is such that we have all of these times when we are in the front story simply being kind of the present moment. And in this case, the sort of present moment, it's sort of loose in this book, but it is that, the end of August after the house has burned down and, Coco is missing, and we know all all of that at the very beginning because the prologue occurs on August 22nd. And then we go back in time, and then we keep coming, to the front story, which is the end of the summer. And then we go back in time to another, development that is happening, in June and July and, the rest of August. So it's this very deft, and I think, I'm not sure people are really like clued into that, but it's a very effective structure because in fact you have this mystery that occurs at the end of the summer. It's a little bit like White Lotus. I mean, not really, but you have this thing that happens at the end and then you're kind of backfilling. And it's really, it's a very good way to create tension right from the start. The other thing that she does, which is very subtle and I think very skillful, is she sometimes overlaps the tales. So you'll have a chunk of the book that has to do with Coco, and then the next thing will be, from Sharon's perspective, but it goes back a tiny bit in time, and it overlaps with what we have seen from Casey. So there's this kind of weaving that is happening in terms of time that is another kind of more subtle structural thing that she is doing. So the structure is very, very well done. It's not like super innovative, like something I've never seen before, but it is, in fact, I think, very effective in terms of building suspense. We're now going to go on to just chat very briefly about a few of my quibbles. So one of them, actually quite a few have to do with Coco. One of them is that this idea of Coco as being like this crazy reader and someone who's always wanting to read and like grew up reading and, is citing Jane Eyre, and then she's talking about Lauren Groff, and then she's talking about, Kate Atkinson. And then, so this very, very, very broad readership, those are very different people. Kate Atkinson, Jane Austen, Lauren Groff, that is a very, very wide, swath of reading. And so I just didn't buy it. I was like, I don't see it. I don't feel this. And it felt like a lot of the literary references that Coco was making, she was sort of like learning about the world of Nantucket through Jane Austen. And I was just sort of like, this is not ringing totally true to me. I also got the sense that this was very much Elin Hilderbrand signaling that she reads a lot of literary fiction. And I know that she does. I think her preference is to read, that was in one of the interviews, she really likes to read, challenging literary fiction. So that's great. And I part of me was like, wow, Lauren Groff is really great. And I like Kate Atkinson, and I like these different, names that she is bringing up. But I didn't believe that, in fact, Coco could have learned so much from them. And I also didn't believe that Coco would read all of the things that she is supposed to be reading. The other thing is that she's a very busy person. I mean, this is someone who she has no time off. She's constantly working. And yet she has gone through like 25 different books over the summer. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but she has read a lot of books over the summer. And part of me is like, when is she doing all of this reading? I also had a little quibble. Her hair is short in the beginning and kind of spiky. So I pictured it as like pretty short. And so by the end of the summer, it's grown to chin length. And I'm like, wait a minute. I just don't, there's like a disconnect. The summer is max like 3 months long. I don't see how we've gone from like a short spiky hairdo to chin length. So those kinds of details, it's interesting because it's a very small kind of quibble on some level, but those are actually very significant because as soon as your reader is sort of like, wait, I don't believe this, then the reader is like, what else am I like just believing that I maybe shouldn't be believing? So when there's something that you recognize, like me, for example, with the type 1 diabetes son, there's part of me that's like, okay, wait, is like, what was all the NICU, description accurate? Like you start doubting the sort of trustworthy nature of your narrator. Not really. I mean, I don't think any of us is like, this is bullshit. There's no way she's reading Kate Atkinson and all these other people. It's not quite that strong, but it was, in fact, a tiny quibble. I also, at one point, Sharon, there's that Mary Oliver, poem about what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life or something. And that, in fact, is something that you see all the time these days on TikTok and on Instagram. And Mary Oliver, I mean, that one poem is really having a moment. And in fact, later in the novel, there's a chapter called like Your One Precious Life. So, Sharon is really leaning into this Mary Oliver thing, which I kind of understood that. But there's another time when Heather, who is Sharon's sister, is talking about The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And I was like, no, like in the marginalia and in the margin, I wrote, nope, because I just didn't buy it. I was like, I just don't see Heather, who is an attorney, like, being like a huge fan of the yellow wallpaper and then explaining it to Sharon. It's a great story, and it's about domesticity, and it's about, women, being constrained by expectations that society has for them. But I was like, this is not ringing quite true to me. I also, somewhat more importantly, I didn't quite buy the chemistry between Coco and Lamont, which, I mean, I can get over that because, like, I understand what we're supposed to be feeling, but it was not totally satisfying to me because I wasn't fully committed to the idea that they would have loved each other. So this is not really a quibble. It's like, in fact, it's like a potential quibble that ends up being a real strength here, which is that there are times when things feel sort of like they're so clever and so good that they like almost are sort of too clever. And one of them is an example on 198. I really enjoyed this. It's the chief thinking about 4th of July. The chief is restless. The 4th is one of his least favorite days of the year. It starts with all the antics out at Nobodere Beach, girls going topless, which that is now, I think that is legal everywhere in Nantucket. Although, what am I saying? Elin definitely knows better than I do. Maybe not at Nobodere. Guys doing flips off the dunes, idiots using empty beer bottles as projectiles, the entire Boston College offensive line getting into a scrap with half the Morgan Stanley trading floor. So I love this. It struck me as being so right on that you would have, these football players like kind of matching up with these like, finance bros. So there are pieces of this that feel like it's almost too cute. And in fact, they actually just really work for me. So again, that's not quite really a quibble. I did have one, another sort of plot point quibble, and it has to do with Heather. Heather, in fact, Googles the Richardsons to figure out like what they're all about and like what their background is. In fact, this is an example of like things being a little bit too convenient. So Heather, who is in fact blonde Sharon's sister, she recognizes the name Bull Richardson and, kind of can't remember why, which that was a bit of a red flag for me. I'm like, why is Sharon's, sister Heather, recognizing this name? And in fact, she Googles him and finds about all of this, criminal stuff that he's involved in. And my marginalia said something like, is she the first one to do this? Like, it seems like somebody would have Googled, Bull Richardson, which maybe the fact that Elin Hilderbrand is having Heather do this is like her thing of like, someone's going to do it. Someone's in fact going to Google these people, which honestly hadn't occurred to me until Heather did it. And I was like, this feels like a little too much. It's like a little too pat, a little too convenient. But all of these quibbles are very, very minor because, in fact, the bulk of this novel, in fact, is just so well done. One funny thing that I want to end with before we read the close of the novel, which again will give nothing away, is that there were a couple of points where Elin did this grammar thing that's like this very, well, it's not a hypercorrection, it's a correct thing. She says this at one point. How did the Richardsons figure out whom to invite? Which just cracked me up because that is correct. You would say, how did they figure out whom to invite? But it's so like kind of, it's not even hoity-toity. It's just like so grammatically kind of overcorrect. Like nobody would say that. You'd say, how'd they figure out who to invite? But this idea of whom to invite, that is the narrator speaking, and it is a little out of voice for the narrator because this is not a stodgy narrator who would be like really like hyper careful about grammar. But it stuck out in a way that I actually really enjoyed. Part of me was like, oh my God, go for it. Elin here is really like, popping off with the grammar. But it was like a little conspicuous. And again, it brought me out of the narrative, which is never great, except that it was about grammar, which I really did appreciate. And then there was another point where she used the word only. So a lot of times people will put only in the wrong place, and she put it in the right place. It was like they were going to give it to only, so-and-so and so-and-so. And it was awkward syntactically, the way that it was like not the way that anybody would ever say that sentence, but in fact, it was the correct placement of only. So I really enjoyed, those little grammatical things just really made up for some of the other quibbles that I was just not super satisfied by. So we begin the novel with Ed and we end the novel with Ed. And I really loved this description with which we end the novel. So we have this. There's another reason he's been lucky, one that is every bit as powerful as the people in his life. And that is this island. The pearlescent gray of the South Shore in the fog, the flock of sheep that graze in the hidden meadows of quays, wading into the chilly water of Pulpus Harbor with his rake on the first day of family scalloping season. Main Street at 5 in the morning after a blizzard, the cobblestones blanketed in snow, the whole town immaculate, white, silent. The first glimpse of spring during Daffodil Festival, mild sunshine on his face as he drives a 1962 Oldsmobile Starfire in the classic car parade. The taste of a deviled egg, everyone wearing their yellow and green, buoyant with the knowledge that another season is beginning. Summer is on its way. It seems like nothing short of a miracle. He found a home on this island 30 miles out to sea, Nantucket. So it's this beautiful ending. It's really an homage, obviously, to the island. And it was so lovely to read because you really get a sense that this is Elin. I mean, this is really Elin who is meditating. And, you know, we talked at the very beginning about how there's like a tiny temptation to conflate Elin and the police chief, Ed, because, in fact, they are both retiring. And, you know, they're just almost no other ways in which I think that they, you know, line up perfectly. But this homage at the end is just so beautifully done. And I like the fact that it takes us through the entire year. So, you know, the front story of the novel is August, and then so we're moving into the fall, and then we get to have this entire experience of the entire year in this really beautiful way that feels sort of all-encompassing. It's just so well done. So I want to end it there. It has been so fun to dig into this novel with you. And I'm very sad that Elin Hilderbrand, in fact, is, she's hung up the bikini. But I am very happy because I have literally 23 other novels that she has written that I can go back to. And again, I'm really excited to read some. I mean, that snowy description of the cobblestones being blanketed by the blizzard, that I think maybe that's going to be one of my next ones. And we will all, wait, and I will be very interested to see what these novels that she ends up writing with her daughter end up being. We all need to stay tuned for that. So thank you so much for tuning in, and, happy reading.